The horse stopped, not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped, the way a living thing stops when it has decided that what lies ahead is not something it will walk through. It was a Tuesday morning in October, cold and gray and ordinary in the way that October mornings in rural Tennessee tend to be. And Holt Greer had been walking Cinder along the eastern fence line the same way he had walked her every morning for 11 years. Her ears were forward, her nostrils were open wide, and she was staring at a patch of ground near the old drainage ditch, a stretch of overgrown brush and dead grass she had passed without incident 1,000 times, and she would not move. Holt tugged the lead. She did not move. He spoke to her the way he always spoke to her when she was uncertain, low, and even. Her name first, and a short, steady reassurance. She turned her head and looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes was not panic and was not confusion. It was something that took him several seconds to name, standing there in the cold, with his coffee going lukewarm and the silence of his 40-acre property pressing in around him. She looked like she was waiting for him to understand something. He did not understand it. Not then. Not for another 6 hours. Holt Greer was 63 years old, and he had lived on this property for 38 of those years, since the year his father signed the deed over to him on the occasion of a retirement that his father. The farm was a mixed operation, never exclusively one thing, because Holt had observed early in his adult life that exclusively one thing was how a farm became fragile. He had cattle, and he had a vegetable plot, and he had Cinder, who was the last of 3 horses he had owned over the decades, the other 2 having died of age-related causes within a year of each other, a coincidence that had hit him harder than he expected, because he had not fully. Cinder had come to him as a 2-year-old from a neighbor who was downsizing, and she had settled into the property and into Holt's routines with a speed and ease that he had taken as an indication of good character. She was not a working horse in the strict sense. He did not need a working horse. She was a horse he walked with and cared for and talked to on the occasions when talking to something that would not respond was exactly what was required. He had been married. That part of his life had been good and had ended not with a dramatic rupture, but with a slow recognition on both sides, and simultaneous enough that there was no clear accusation to be made. His ex-wife Marguerite lived in Nashville now, with a life that sounded full and active and like it fit her. He bore her no ill feeling. He had a daughter from that marriage, Remy, Sunday, with the particular mix of genuine care and low-grade guilt that adult children of relatively self-sufficient parents tend to carry. He loved her completely and told her so. What this meant on the ground was that Holt Greer's mornings were his own, ordered by his own rhythms, answered to by no one, which was a condition he had made his peace with. He woke early. He made coffee. He walked Cinder before the day had fully decided what it was going to be. This was his life, and it had not prepared him in any way for what that particular Tuesday morning was about to ask of him. But by the time he understood what it had asked of him, there were 3 sheriff's deputies, 2 FBI agents. They still cannot. What they found near that drainage ditch on a Tuesday morning in October would close one of the longest missing persons cases in the history of Carroll County, and it would begin with a horse who refused to take one more step forward. Her name was Cinder, and she had always known something was wrong out there. The question that no one could answer, not then and not in the months that followed, was how long she had known and what it meant that the rest of them had taken 4 years to figure out what she had understood from the beginning. That question would matter more than any of them realized, not to the morning Cinder stopped, but to the morning everything else started, the morning 2 little girls disappeared. It was a Saturday in April, 4 years and 7 months before Cinder locked her legs into the earth on that fence line. Their names were Sella and Ivy Ashby. Sella was 9, Ivy was 6. And they lived in a pale yellow farmhouse on Millbrook Road, about 2.5 miles east of Holt Greer's property. They had a tire swing in the front yard, a cat named Biscuit, and a mother who made pancakes from scratch on Saturday mornings, which is what Wren had been doing when they vanished. She had been standing at the stove. She could hear them in the yard. She poured more batter. When she looked up, the yard was empty. The 30 seconds, she did not look up. She would spend 1,000 nights replaying those 30 seconds. Neighbors, volunteers, deputies, dogs. By nightfall, there were more than 80 people combing the woods and fields around Millbrook Road. And by morning, the FBI had been called, and Sella and Ivy Ashby were still gone. The investigation would consume the next 4 years. It would generate thousands of pages of reports, dozens of persons of interest, interviews that went nowhere, leads that dissolved, moments of terrible hope followed by longer stretches of despair. There would be a suspect brought in for questioning 18 months in, a man named Roy Fenwick, who had a record and had been seen near the school the previous fall, and he would be held for 72 hours and then released for lack of evidence. There would be reported sightings, 2 of which would briefly electrify the investigation, and both of which would prove to be other children, other families, other heartbreaks. There would be an anonymous tip 2 years in that pointed toward an abandoned property in the next county, and that search would last a week and find nothing of significance. And through all of it, Wren Ashby would remain in the pale yellow farmhouse on Millbrook Road. The light was a specific light. This matters in the way that specific details of grief always matter, because grief lives in the specific, in the exact object and the exact habit, rather than in the general. That Wren had never replaced, because it had always been there, and changing. It had never seemed important enough to bother with. She had started turning it on the night the girls went missing, not consciously at first, not as a decision exactly, but as an action her body took while her mind was elsewhere, the same way hands sometimes do things while their owner is occupied somewhere else inside themselves. By the second week, she understood that she was doing it deliberately. By the second month, she understood that it had become a kind of contract with an unspecified party, a statement of position rather than a practical measure. The light was for the record. It was Wren's way of saying to whatever force or chance or sequence of events was holding her daughters that she had not moved, had not reorganized her expectations to accommodate absence, had not made her peace with the shape of things as they had become. She ate. She slept some. She worked because the bills did not pause and the land did not pause, and she was not a person who found relief in the suspension of practical demands. She talked to the investigators regularly in the first year, then less regularly as the months accumulated their weight. She talked to a counselor for a while and then stopped, not because the counselor had done anything wrong, but because she had reached a point. She wanted to stay in the position of someone who considered it temporary. This was not denial in the clinical sense. She understood the statistics. She understood what the investigators did not say out loud and what the passage of time implied. She understood all of it. She simply refused to let understanding change her posture, and her posture was, I am waiting for them to come back. She tended the tire swing. She kept Biscuit the cat, who was old now and moved slowly and slept in a patch of sunlight on the kitchen floor in the afternoons. She planted the garden every spring and harvested it every fall and put up the same preserves she had always put up. She kept the doors open so the rooms breathed, but she did not go in. There was a particular kind of fortitude in not going in, the decision to leave a space intact for its original occupants rather than for the purposes of the person who is waiting. Wren was 41 when the girls disappeared. She was 45 when the phone rang. She kept the light on every night for 4 years and 7 months. Her husband Declan, who had not been home the morning the girls disappeared, who had driven into town early to pick up a part for the truck's engine and had been gone less than 2 hours, and the scrutiny would put a crack in their marriage that the following 4 years would not repair. He moved out after the first year. Not because he stopped loving Wren, and not because he believed she had done anything wrong, but because every time they were in the same room together, they were also in that Saturday morning. If Sella and Ivy somehow found their way back to Millbrook Road, she needed to be there. She needed them to see the light on in the window. She needed them to know she had not left. Every Saturday morning, the day of the week they disappeared, he drove back to Millbrook Road and sat in his truck at the end of the driveway for an hour. He never went in. He never got out of the truck. He just sat there, as though presence alone was a form of faith that something might change. He had been sitting in that truck every Saturday morning for 4 years when the phone call came on a Tuesday. It was Petra Stiles who made the call. She was the Carroll County detective who had been assigned the case from the beginning and had never fully let it go. Even as the active investigation wound down and the file moved to a different drawer and her caseload filled with other things. Petra was 51, names in the margins of printed reports that her colleagues found strange and she found necessary. She had written Sella and Ivy's names in the margins of hundreds of documents over 4 years, the way some people keep a name alive by saying it out loud, asking about anything unusual, anything that had changed, anything that did not fit. A notation about an old drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of his fence line and connected underground to a culvert system that ran beneath Millbrook Road. She had driven out to talk to Holt twice in 4 years. Both times she had asked about the eastern fence, the drainage area, whether he had seen anything unusual out there. Both times he had said no. He had not been lying. He genuinely had not seen anything unusual. Cinder had always been uneasy near the eastern fence. Not panicked, not violent, just unwilling. She would slow near that stretch, would sometimes stop briefly and look toward the drainage ditch with those wide, dark nostrils, then move again when he urged her. He had assumed there was something in the brush, a groundhog burrow or a den of something that made her cautious. But on that Tuesday morning in October, she did not just slow. She stopped, and she stayed stopped, with their whole body and their held breath, and that particular direction of their ears. And whatever she was pointing at was in or near or under that drainage ditch. He tied her lead to the fence post, which she accepted without protest, and walked toward the ditch himself. The ground there was wet from 3 days of rain. The brush was thick, mostly yellowed and flattened by the autumn cold. The ditch itself was a shallow channel, maybe 2 feet deep, mostly filled with leaves and runoff, running along the fence line for about 30 yards before it disappeared underground through a corrugated metal culvert that was half choked with debris. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing looked different from the way it always looked. He was about to turn back when his boot caught on something under the leaves. He looked down. There was a piece of fabric. Faded pink, partially buried, mostly rotted, but still visible if you were standing in exactly this spot looking at exactly this angle. And he had never stood in exactly this spot because Cinder had never let him walk this close to the ditch before. And now that he thought about it, she had been steering him away from this stretch of fence for as long as he could remember. He used a stick, not his hands, because something about the way the fabric lay in the earth made him careful without knowing why. He moved a layer of leaves. He found the edge of something. He moved another layer. And then he stood up straight and walked back to the fence where Cinder was tied and took out his phone and called the county sheriff. And while he waited for the call to connect, he looked at the Mare, and she was looking at him, and her ears were still forward, and she had not moved an inch. 2 deputies arrived within 20 minutes. One of them was on his radio within 5 minutes of arriving. Petra Stiles was there within 40. And by early afternoon, with a crime scene team working the drainage ditch and the brush around it, she made the call to Wren Ashby that she had been both dreading and desperate to make for 4 years. She did not tell Wren everything over the phone. She told her that something had been found on a property near hers, and that she needed to come, and that she should not come alone. Wren called Declan. She had not called him outside of their Sunday phone calls in over a year. That was the thing about Declan Ashby, that people who only knew the outline of his story sometimes forgot. The outline made him look like someone who had left. The truth was that every time the worst thing threatened to happen, he drove toward it. They arrived at Holt Greer's property at 2:15 in the afternoon. The sky had gone from gray to a flat white that made the light feel distant and directionless. Holt met them at the gate, a quiet man with a weathered face who had the careful way of speaking that some people develop when they have spent most of their life outdoors and alone. And he walked them to the area near the drainage ditch without saying much beyond what was necessary. Cinder was still tied to the fence post. She had not been moved. When Wren walked past her, the horse turned and watched her, and that watching was so steady, so intentional, that Wren stopped walking for a moment and looked back. She had not been around horses since she was a teenager. She did not know how to read them, that this animal was watching her the way you watch someone you have been waiting for. But the crime scene team had found something else by then, something that changed the shape of the case entirely, and that forced everyone involved to rethink not just what had happened on that Saturday morning 4 years ago. The lead investigator on the federal side was a man named Callaway Marsh, and he had been in the field long enough to know that cases like this one, cold cases that reopened not from tips or confessions, but from accidents, from animals and random discoveries, were often the most complicated kind. Time to be shaped into something misleading. Time to suggest one story while hiding another one entirely. He had been in this field for 26 years, and he had learned a particular form of professional compartmentalization. That was not coldness and was not indifference, but was the specific skill of holding a thing at the distance necessary to keep working while remaining close enough to it that you never stopped understanding what it was. He called it focus. Other people called it what they called it. It was the reason he was good at his job, and also the reason that his wife had pointed out that there were evenings when he came home and she could not tell if he was fully present in the room or still somewhere else entirely. She was right. He was usually somewhere else. On evenings after cases like this one, he was always somewhere else. A small sneaker, size 4, pink with a Velcro strap. A plastic hair clip in the shape of a butterfly. A folded piece of paper in a Ziploc bag, the bag partially degraded, but still sealed, and the paper inside still legible. The handwriting on it was a child's. Callaway read it before showing it to Wren, and his face as he read it was the face of someone working hard not to react. It said that the man said they would be home soon. It said that Ivy was scared sometimes, but she was okay, and that Sella was taking care of her. And it said, at the bottom, in the smaller and more careful letters of a 9-year-old trying to write clearly, "We are under the ground, but we are okay. We can hear the cars on the road sometimes at night. Tell Biscuit we are okay." In writing a note, she had no guarantee would ever be found, to reassure her family that the cat was included in her concern. That detail did something to Callaway that straightforward descriptions of fear or pain would not have, because it was not fear and it was not pain. It was ordinary love under extraordinary conditions. And ordinary love under extraordinary conditions is the thing that professional distance is worst at keeping at arm's length. He held the note in its evidence sleeve for several seconds before he called one of the forensic team members over to log it and bag it properly. They were alive when this was written. He knew that immediately, and he also knew what the note meant about the location. Under the ground, cars on the road, the culvert system under Millbrook Road, the drainage infrastructure that connected this ditch to the road, underground, had not been checked 4 years ago because no one had known it was there, and neither had Holt Greer, but someone else had known. She was not inside the tape. She was standing where the line was, and she was watching them work. What she understood, watching them work, was that the culvert chamber had been used across multiple periods of time. He had been moving them, which meant, in turn, that the chamber was not the only location, and that finding the chamber was the beginning of an answer rather than the answer itself, and that the most important question, where are they now, was still entirely open. She had understood this within an hour of arriving. Calloway had understood it too. They had worked cases together before, not many, but enough to have developed the shorthand of people who process information in compatible ways. The forensic people could not give them a number that night. What they could give them was a range of indicators that suggested the last occupation of the culvert chamber was not recent, and that the current location of the girls was somewhere else, and that somewhere else was not on the map yet. And the quality of the air around the floodlights seemed to change when Calloway put that out loud to the assembled team. But saying it out loud, with a clock, turned it into something that required different movement. The county sheriff authorized additional resources by 10 that evening. By midnight, 2 more federal agents had driven down from Nashville, 1,990, looking for anything that fit a specific profile. Isolated, rarely accessed, large enough, on a property with older title history that might have disused structures not captured in recent assessments. The list was longer than any of them wanted it to be. Someday matter, old barns, equipment sheds, root cellars. She crossed off 8 immediately. 2 visible, 2 trafficked, wrong access patterns. She flagged 3 as high priority based on location relative to the culvert access road conditions, and a factor she could not fully articulate that had something to do with the way they appeared in aerial photographs. That did not obviously connect to the case. Osah Finch's report was in there, filed 14 months ago. Dog digging near foundation of disused outbuilding. Like touching something you yourself had put away in a drawer and lost track of, and were only now understanding the significance of. He made the decision about how to tell Wren honestly and directly, with the specific pieces she needed in the right order. He would not give her probability estimates. He had learned over 26 years that probability estimates given to parents in situations like this one were an act of violence dressed as information. She did not need a probability. She needed facts, and she needed to know that everyone around her was working as fast as they could, and the ground was wet under his feet. And then he arrived at where they were standing and started to speak. Wren read the note at 3:47 in the afternoon, standing in a field in the cold with Declan beside her. And when she looked up, her face was not the face of someone crying. And the sheer physical shock of that permission was almost more than she could carry. She said one thing. She said they were alive when she wrote this. Calloway said yes. She said, then where are they now? And that was the question that would drive the next 72 hours, which were the most concentrated and high-pressure hours of the entire investigation, and which would end in a way that none of the investigators expected, in a place that the evidence alone would never have pointed them toward. Calloway did not tell Wren about the note until the area around the culvert had been fully searched. What they found there was not the girls, who were not there, but evidence that someone had been, where the pipe widened into a concrete chamber that predated the surrounding development and had been built as a flood control measure decades earlier. In that chamber, they found food containers, blankets, handwriting on the walls in marker drawings, a child's shoe matching the one found in the ditch, a tin can with holes punched through it that had been used as a lantern. The girls had been kept there, not for 4 years continuously, but in that space, at some point, for a period that the forensic evidence would later determine to be at least several weeks. And then they had been moved. This was when the case split into 2 simultaneous investigations, one reaching backward into what had happened in that space, and one reaching forward, urgently, because if the girls had been moved, and the note said they were alive when it was written, the question of where they were now was not a historical question. It was an immediate one. That is the part of this story that most people who heard it later found the hardest to hold in their minds. The strange, desperate hope that arrives when you have been grieving for something and suddenly learn you may not have finished grieving for the right reason yet. It would end because of a second animal. Not Cinder this time, but a dog named Wick who had belonged to a neighbor 2 miles north of the Greer property. A retired schoolteacher named O.S.A. Finch, digging near the foundation of an old outbuilding at the back of her property, a disused equipment storage shed that had been there when she bought the place and that she had never bothered to demolish, because demolishing things was expensive and it was far. Enough from the house that it did not bother her. The deputy who took that call had noted it. He had noted it without connecting it to the Ashby case, because it did not obviously connect. Petra Stiles found that file at 9 o'clock on the evening the culvert was discovered. She had gone back to the office, alone, and she had started pulling every report that referenced properties within 3 miles of the Greer fence line. Any report, any kind, any year. She was looking for something she could not name. In the 4 years since the girls disappeared, she had become a different kind of detective than she had been before. Not in the ways that get talked about, not harder or more clinical or more given to distance, but different in a more specific way. She had become a detective who understood that presence is its own form of evidence. It had moved into her, the way long cases do, become part of how she oriented herself in the world. She would drive the roads near Millbrook Road without consciously deciding to. She would look at properties and think about drainage and access and concealment without specifically trying to. She had spent 4 years letting the case run in the background of everything else she did, the way some people let music run in rooms where they are working, present but not demanding full attention, until the moment it needed to be fully heard. By 9:15, she was in her car. The outbuilding on O.S.A. Finch's property was a low wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof, maybe 20 feet by 30, set back from the tree line on the north side of the property. It was padlocked, which O.S.A. said she had not padlocked. She had never padlocked it. She did not own a padlock that size, and when she showed Petra the other outbuildings on the property, none of them had locks that matched it. Someone else had put that lock there. Petra called Calloway at 9:44. She called him before she touched the lock, before she asked O.S.A. to call anyone, and the second time she was sure, and the third time she was already on her radio. She stood at that door for a count that she later estimated at 30 seconds, but that felt, in the way significant moments compress and expand time, like much longer. She had her flashlight in one hand and her radio in the other, and she did not move. Not because she doubted herself. She had done this before, not in this case, but in others, had stood at the edge of a moment and stepped forward before she should have, and the cost of that was something she carried, so she counted. 30 seconds. She listened. The sound continued. Low, rhythmic, the particular quality of a child's voice in the lower registers of its range. Not a full voice, not a projection, but the sound of someone singing very quietly to themselves or to a specific listener, the intimate register of a song that belongs to a small space. She keyed her radio. She said Calloway's name, and then gave him the address, and then said 3 words. I think they're here. She had not said, I think about something on a radio in this particular tone of voice since early in her career. She had not known until that moment that the emotion had been building that high, that close to the surface, or that a single sentence of 8 words could carry 26 years of this work in its inflection. Calloway said, Don't move. I'm 2 minutes out. She did not move. She stood at that door and listened to the singing on the other side of it. and she kept her flashlight steady on the lock, and she waited for the sound of tires on the gravel behind her. She had been learning patience from a farmer and a horse without knowing it. She had been learning it from Wren Ashby, who had left the light on in a window for nearly half a decade. She stood there in the cold with her radio and her flashlight. She was hearing a child's voice, very low, almost below speaking. A song Wren later identified as a lullaby she had sung to both of them when they were very small. A simple thing with no particular origin that she had made up herself out of half-remembered melodies and words that felt right. Sela had learned it by hearing it so many times in her first years that it had become structural to her. She had been singing it every night in every place they had been kept. And she had been singing it on that Tuesday evening in October, low and steady in the dark. And Petra Stiles heard it through a wooden door and stood very still and did not move until she was sure. And then she moved fast. The door came off its hinges inside of 4 minutes with the right equipment, and the light from outside fell into that space. 2 girls, one 13 and one 10, sitting together on a cot in the corner of the space, not in immediate physical distress, not visibly harmed in the acute sense, but looking at the light coming through the door with eyes that had had to recalibrate what normal brightness meant. Ivy had her hands over her ears. Sela was shielding her sister with one arm, the way she apparently always did when something unexpected happened, the way she had been doing for 4 years and 7 months. She was looking at Petra directly, and Petra noticed that she did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that if the door ever opened, the response would not be fear. She looked like someone who had been preparing to be found. Calloway arrived within 12 minutes. Medical personnel arrived within 20. Wren and Declan Ashby arrived 40 minutes after Petra's call, because some things belong only to the people inside them. But one thing was noted by 2 separate people who were standing near the entrance to that outbuilding. When Wren walked through the door and crossed the room and reached her daughters, Sela, who had not cried in the 40 minutes between the door coming off its hinges and her mother's arrival, made a sound that one deputy described simply as the most human sound he had ever heard in 22 years of this work. He did not say what kind of sound. He said only that it was the sound of something very tightly held being released. Ivy did not speak. Ivy had apparently not spoken in some time. This would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case in the weeks and months that followed. The particular way that Ivy Ashby, who had been talkative and loud and full of noise as a 6-year-old, the doctors would say it was not permanent, had a connection to the area that predated the Ashby family's move to Millbrook Road by more than a decade. He had grown up in Carroll County. He had worked briefly for a county drainage contractor in his 20s and knew the culvert system the way someone knows a place. There is no reason that carries weight against what those 2 girls experienced. Calloway said this publicly once when pressed about motive by a reporter, and he said it in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. He was right to say it. What mattered, in the end, was not the reason. What mattered was the finding. He was not the kind of man who attended press conferences, and he was not the kind of man who sought attention for things he felt he had not earned. And his contribution, as he saw it, was nothing more than having finally paid attention to something he should have paid attention to years ago. That was the part he kept returning to in the weeks that followed. Not the pride of it, not the outcome, but the years before the outcome. Cinder had been slowing near that fence line for as long as he could remember. He had noticed it and categorized it and moved on. He had not been incurious about it exactly. He had been complacently curious, the way people are about things that are unusual but not urgent. He was not a man given to self-punishment, and he did not punish himself for it. But he thought about it. He thought about it with the particular weight of knowing that the thing he had not examined had been real and had mattered. Who had come back to the property 6 weeks after the discovery to walk the site one more time and close out her documentation. He told her about the fence line, about Cinder's habit of slowing and looking toward the ditch, about the years he had treated it as a minor behavioral quirk. She said she had a similar version of the same thought about OSA Finch's report, about the 14 months between when that file was created and when she found it. She said she did not know what to do with that time, whether to account for it, or absorb it, or simply accept that it existed and move forward with what she had learned from it. About being close enough that a different decision would have changed the outcome. She said she had not reached any conclusions yet. Holt nodded and said he had not either. She was in the paddock near the barn, and when he leaned on the fence rail, she came over, the way she always came over, without being called. He scratched her jaw the way she liked, and she pressed her head into his hand, and he stood there for a while, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Across the county, in the weeks and months after that night, the Ashby family was learning what it meant to find something you had spent years grieving. It was not, as Wren would later say in a rare interview, what she had imagined. She had imagined many versions of reunion over 4 years, had played them out in her mind, the way people in extreme situations use the imagination as a form of survival. But relief, she discovered, does not cancel what came before it. It arrives alongside everything else. It does not arrive instead. Sella came home, and Sella had been changed. Not broken, not in the way Wren had feared most during the long nights, but changed in the way that anyone is changed by an extended experience of something very hard, which is that they become someone for whom that experience is now part of their architecture, not a wound to be healed and forgotten, but a structural element that the rest of them is built around. She was capable and careful, and sometimes very funny in the dry, understated way of teenagers. She monitored Ivy constantly, noticed any distress before Wren did, would position herself between Ivy and any situation she had not yet assessed as safe. This was not something she did consciously, had become part of her nervous system. The therapists worked with it carefully, not trying to dismantle it, but trying to help her understand that she did not need to carry it in the same way now, that there were other people who could share the weight of keeping Ivy safe, that she could set it down in increments without betraying anything she had promised herself in the dark. She heard them. She made progress. Years later, when she was old enough to talk about the experience in fuller terms, she would say that the thing she remembered most clearly was not fear, although fear had been present, and was not the worst moments, although there had been worst moments. The decision she had made in the first weeks, when she understood that no one was coming immediately, and that she was responsible for Ivy in a way. She had never been responsible for anything before, to make order, to make routine, to make a structure that Ivy could orient herself inside, so that Ivy did not feel the full formlessness of what they were in. She had set meal times and small tasks, and a morning ritual and an evening ritual. She had kept track of days as best she could and marked them. She had told Ivy stories, long stories with characters that continued across multiple nights. She had maintained the lullaby every single night. She did not think of it as a decision at the time. She thought of it as the only possible thing. Ivy came home and did not speak for 3 months. Then one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Wren was making dinner, she said, "The horse knew." Those were the first words she spoke at home. She said the horse knew, and when Wren turned from the stove and asked what she meant, Ivy said, "When we were under the ground, I used to hear it sometimes. In the mornings, the sound of hooves on the ground above the pipe. It was the same one every time." She said this with the certainty of a child who had spent months listening to the texture of a world she could not see. And when she told him what Ivy had said, he was quiet for a long time on his end. Then he asked which time of morning, and she asked Ivy, and Ivy said early, before it was fully light, always the same direction. Holt said that was Cinder's fence line walk. That was the walk they had been doing every morning for 11 years. The eastern fence line, past the drainage ditch. He said she knew they were there. He said it quietly, not with drama, the way someone states a thing that has just arranged itself into undeniable clarity. And then Wren asked him if she could bring the girls to meet her. He said yes, of course. They came on a Saturday morning in December, 2 months after the girls came home. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, cold and high and very blue, and Holt had brought Cinder in from the paddock and brushed her until her coat caught the light properly. He had not done this for a particular reason he could have explained. It had simply felt right to present her well. She went to Ivy first. She lowered her head and put her nose against Ivy's shoulder, very gently and breathed, the long warm exhalation of a horse at rest. And Ivy raised her hand and put it against Cinder's jaw, the way you touch something you have been trying to reach for a very long time. She did not say anything. She stood there with her small hand against that animal's jaw, and the morning was very bright and very cold, and the sound of whatever passed between them had no name in any language anyone present could have used. Then she asked Holt if she could brush her, and he handed her the brush without a word, and she started at the neck the way he showed her, long even strokes, the horse absolutely still under her hands. Declan was there. He had come with them, standing back from the fence with his hands in his pockets, and he was watching his daughters in the morning light. He and Wren would not fully repair what had broken between them. That is a part of this story that deserves to be told honestly, because the arrival of something good does not automatically reverse every consequence of the time it took to arrive. They would find a new kind of closeness. They would show up for their daughters. They would show up for each other in the ways that mattered. And there would be Saturday mornings, years later, when Declan still drove to Millbrook Road. She took the promotion quietly and without ceremony and put a new map on her kitchen wall the following week, because there were other names in the margins of other files, and she had not finished. Callaway Marsh retired 3 years after the case closed. He gave one brief speech at his retirement gathering and said very little of substance, which was characteristic of him, except for one thing. He said that in 30 years of this work, he had been taught more by the cases that ended well than by the ones that did not, because the ones that ended well insisted on showing you what the work was actually capable of, and that was both the hardest and the most important thing to hold on to. The man who took the girls is in a federal correctional facility. He will be there for a very long time. That is all anyone who loves those girls needs to know about him. Holt Greer still walks Cinder along the eastern fence line every morning. Flatter, more open, less like a place where something could be hidden, and more like a place that has been examined and understood. Cinder still slows when she reaches that stretch of fence. He has stopped trying to urge her through it. He stands there with her instead in the early morning. He lets her have her time there. He has come to believe that whatever she perceives in that spot is not something that will stop, that it is in the nature of the place now, absorbed into the soil the way significant things sometimes are, and that she is not alarmed by it, only aware. Aware of it the way she has always been aware of it, the way she was aware of it before anyone else. Through the entire length of a cold winter and a spring and a summer, and another year and another and another, every single morning, in the dark before the light fully arrived, walking the same path she had always walked, slowing at the same stretch of fence, she did not dig them out. She did not lead anyone there. She stood at a fence and refused to move, and a man finally crouched down in the mud where he had never crouched down before, and found something and made a call. That is all she did. But she had been standing at that fence, looking at that ground, in the mornings before anyone was awake to see her, for 4 years and 7 months. A girl had listened to the sound of hooves on the ground above her. That means someone is here.